Now we're on to Chapter 18, all about politics and railroad domination. We've talked a little bit about this in the past couple of chapters, but this chapter will emphasize this particular critical period in California history. The authors attempt to balance historians' writings, which call the influence of the Southern Pacific as monolithic and complete, while other historians' writings say, well, maybe the railroad brought stability and a strengthened economy to California. So the authors try to tread on middle ground here, but the preponderance of the evidence suggests that the political and economic influence, especially the political influence and the conflict of interest with respect to the operation of the Southern Pacific Railroad, pervaded every aspect of California. Quoting Rawls and Bean, they say, it was true, of course, that the railroad control was far from complete, but in general it was highly effective. The power of the Southern Pacific was not a monolith, nor was it a myth. So I guess it was somewhere in between. There were the workings of Southern Pacific's invisible government, but those invisible government workings of the Southern Pacific could not always be kept invisible, as evidenced in the Colton letters, which are quite interesting. All right, so here's the deal. David D. Colton was the confidential manager of the Southern Pacific Railroad's political interests in California, while Collis P. Huntington, you remember him, one of the big four, did the same thing. He did the railroad's bidding in Washington, D.C. as a lobbyist. Some newspapers then described the Big Four, because of the addition of Colton and his work, as the Big Four and a Half, which is kind of interesting. Now, Colton died in 1878. His widow discovered, through details of the late Mark Hopkins' estate, remember Hopkins was one of the Big Four, that Hopkins' shares of stock in Southern Pacific Railroad had considerably higher value than those of her late husband. She received about $500,000 in the settlement of her husband's estate, and she really felt that she got the raw end of the deal, considering that she discovered that Mark Hopkins' shares were worth much more than her husband's. She sued the Big Four in 1883 for a bigger settlement. In this trial, letters between Colton and Huntington revealed Colton's activities in influencing elections, re-elections, and votes in Congress. The state Supreme Court, and also, by the way, in the State House, the state Supreme Court refused to award Mrs. Colton a larger settlement, but the damage done to the Southern Pacific's Railroad's reputation was of far greater value than those of Colton's widow's highest demands, if you get my drift. So she may have had her demands and she lost the lawsuit, but the bringing to light of this invisible governing part of the Southern Pacific Railroad and how it influenced federal and state government, this did a lot of damage to the SPRR at the time. Then there were the Dear Pard letters. Collis P. Huntington had a long-standing resentment of people who ran for public office, including his partner, Leland Stanford. Of course, as you remember, he was U.S. Senator, he was Governor of California, and so on, at the same time that he was the president of the Southern Pacific Railroad. That would never be allowed today. Huntington declared that he would support Stanford's election to a second term as U.S. Senator only if he, meaning Huntington, were elected to the presidency of the Southern Pacific Railroad in return, a post that Stanford held for 30 years that Huntington highly coveted. After assuming this presidency of the SPRR, after Stanford gave it up to be U.S. Senator for a second term, Huntington declared that the SPRR would not use his position to advance his personal ambition, unlike what Stanford did. So basically, now that Huntington was president, he said he wasn't going to advance his own personal ambition like Stanford did when he was the president of the SPRR. In 1892, Stanford's former personal secretary published letters to Huntington called the Dear Pard letters, which were designed by Stanford and his operatives to ruin Huntington's reputation. So they were fighting each other in this very public way in the newspapers. When Stanford was the president of the Southern Pacific Railroad, he also wanted a harbor built in what is now San Pedro, down by just north of Long Beach there. But now that Huntington was president of the Southern Pacific Railroad, he announced that he would block any congressional appropriation or subsidy for a harbor at San Pedro because he wanted it built in Santa Monica, even though all the engineering studies at the time strongly suggested that San Pedro would be a better location for such a harbor. Los Angeles rebelled and they fought Huntington, along with Harrison Gray Otis. We mentioned him earlier, the owner of the LA Times, who led the opposition along with the city of LA to fight Huntington because, again, Huntington wanted the harbor built at Santa Monica, and the SPRR and Stanford wanted originally that harbor to be built at San Pedro. There was a second Army engineering report that came out and favored San Pedro as the preferred site. So now there are two Army engineering reports that favored San Pedro, engineering-wise, as the better site for the harbor. Huntington lost his fight against the city of LA in 1899, and the harbor was built at San Pedro. Then there's this business about the original railroad funding bill that helped the Central Pacific, the Transcontinental, get built. Remember, this was made possible with federal loans. The amount was $28 million, payable in 30 years, which would have been then due in 1899 because they were taken out in, I think, 1869. At 6% annual simple interest. So when they were due and payable in 1899, the added interest would have made the balance due by then roughly $80 million. So a lot more money, of course, than the original principal amount of this loan. All during this time, after the CPRR was built and then they started the SPRR, the Big Four took dividends for themselves all these years and did not set aside dollars for payment of said loans and interest. So the federal government in 1878 required the Big Four to establish what they called a sinking fund, which is the type of fund that would accrue from federally funded rail lines, so when the debt was due and payable in 1899, it could be paid. The Big Four engaged in creative accounting, so to speak, to keep this fund as low a balance as possible, and this is when, of course, opposition to railroad power really started to mount. Adolf Sutro is somebody we should mention in Chapter 18. He was a millionaire as a result of the Comstock lode in Nevada. He owned 1/12 of all of San Francisco's entire area. He had a grand residence near what is today's Cliff House. He opened the private grounds up as a public park, and of course you can also see the ruins of what used to be these public baths out there, the Sutro baths. The Southern Pacific Railroad subsidy took over a trolley line to that part of the city. And when they did so, they refused to continue a low round fare trip for people in the city of San Francisco who wanted to get out to Sutro's private residence, which again was opened as a public park by Sutro. So Sutro, with all the money he had, built his own parallel trolley line and declared himself the defender of the octopus. And of course, that was the term they used in the days when people were criticizing the Southern Pacific Railroad. And he ran for mayor of San Francisco and won in 1896. Looking at William Randolph Hearst and Ambrose Bierce, going back to these two gentlemen for a moment, Hearst was also opposed to the railroad funding plan. So he threw his full weight of the San Francisco Examiner against it. In advance of a crucial congressional vote in 1896. He had his columnist Ambrose Bierce write lots of articles against the funding bill, which were merciless, according to the authors of your textbook. This infuriated Huntington, and the railroad funding bill was voted down in Congress in January of 1897. So bottom line is, Huntington didn't get his way. They were trying to defer all those payments to the government or eliminate them entirely, but Congress wasn't going for it. They wanted that money due and payable for the loans that they extended to the Big Four in order to build the Transcontinental Railroad 30 years before. While the funding bill and the LA Harbor issue were significant national defeats for Huntington and the Southern Pacific Railroad, the railroad continued to wield merciless power at the state and local level. There was a railroad political manager in every county in California. Now, they mostly worked with the Democratic Party, but they'd work with whatever party wielded the most power in a particular county or district, or they would influence bosses of both parties to get their way if necessary. They would just give money to any party that they felt would give them the most influence in any county or district in California. Uh, Most importantly, the railroad controlled who was appointed to the Bank Commission. Uh, that was very, very significant with respect to political control. They issued free rail passes to politicians, even though this was illegal, but everybody was getting them that was in any position of power. It's important to note William F. Herron here. He was an attorney who won a national reputation for defending a federal marshal, David Nagel, against a murder charge. Now, this impressed Huntington so much that he hired Herron to be Southern Pacific Railroad's Western political manager. So basically, Herron took over where Colton, who had died in 1878, left off, managing the SPRR's manifold political activities and grappled with all of its complex legal and political problems. Uh, because of the criticism of so many people by the railroads, there were attempts at political reform to rein in that power that they had, but most of these efforts failed, which tended to add a sense of public futility that they couldn't do anything about this monster that was the railroad. One political movement tried to adopt the so-called Australian secret ballot method in 1891, but this only applied to general elections and not the nominating process of the political parties, for which there was no effective legal regulation. So political parties could get direct influence from the railroad to nominate certain candidates who would eventually win, who favored, of course, the way the railroads operated. But the secret ballot was about the only reform that was actually initiated at this point. By this point in time, the Southern Pacific was leaning more toward the Republican Party candidates to do their so-called work. The Democratic Party failed dismally to provide an effective vehicle for reforms to try to combat the power of the railroad. There was a nationalist political movement established, and then the populist political movement was started, and it morphed into what became eventually in the early 1900s something called the progressive political movement, which no doubt we will learn a lot more about in chapters 19 and 20. That ends the narrated PowerPoint for chapter 18.